This is the breakout section entitled Left, Right, and Israeli National Security. It's a conversation with Elliott Abrams, whom I will introduce in a moment. My name is Mike Doran, and I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Here's how the session will proceed. Elliott will speak for about 20-25 minutes. He and I will discuss his remarks for another 15-20 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. The issue before us is both fascinating and consequential. The majority of Jews in America are affiliated with the Democratic Party, I'm sure you're aware of that, which is showing signs of increasing unease with Zionism. The Republican Party, meanwhile, is becoming ever more supportive of the Jewish state. These broad trends are taking place at a moment when America's policy toward the Middle East seems to be in flux. Many observers are claiming that America is withdrawing from the Middle East. How do we make sense of these developments? Well, fortunately for us, we have Elliott Abrams here to help us think through these questions. Elliott is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He's one of the foremost experts in the country on American foreign policy in general, and especially toward the Middle East. He's a man of considerable learning. He has an undergraduate degree and a law degree from Harvard, and an advanced degree in international politics from the London School of Economics. He's fluent in French and Spanish. He teaches part-time at Georgetown about American foreign policy, on which he is a prolific commentator in all leading newspapers and on television. He writes a blog that is mandatory reading for anyone interested in the Middle East. He has written 5 books and edited several more. His latest, just published, is Realism and Democracy, American Foreign Policy After the Arab Spring. Elliott's scholarly resume alone outshines the resumes of most professional academics. But research, writing, and teaching is just a hobby for him. Elliott is first and foremost a man of affairs. Time will not permit me to hit all of his professional achievements. Forgive me as I cover only the highlights. Elliott served as a Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of George W. Bush. In that capacity, he simultaneously supervised 2 offices in the National Security Council, the one responsible for the Middle East and North Africa, and the one that was responsible for democracy, human rights, and international organizations. For 2 years, I have to say, he also oversaw me. I worked for him in the Middle East section. I wasn't going to say anything personal, but I will tell you, his resume is so impressive. But even today in this discussion, you won't actually see the thing that is most impressive about Elliott, and that is that he, as a policy practitioner, he has no peer, I believe. And I've worked very closely with him. He absorbs information quickly and translates it into policy instantaneously. I once sent him, I could go on and on about this, I'll just tell you one story. I sent him a document at 5 o'clock. It came back to me at 5:01 with tracked changes. And these are not just, he's a great writer, you know, but these are not just edits for language, they're edits for policy. So he changes one word, and the document, the document goes from marriage to divorce, right? It's amazing. And that, being able to do that in a bureaucratic context is so valuable because you with one word you can disarm people. Okay. Anyway, that's the last anecdote. He first came to national prominence in the Reagan administration when he was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for Human Affairs and Humanitarian Affairs. If I'm not mistaken, he was at that time the youngest person ever to have been appointed Assistant Secretary of State. Elliott was also the Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs, which means he is as knowledgeable about Latin America as he is about the Middle East. There's much more that I could say about his achievements, but we actually want to listen to him say something. So Elliott, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. Now you see why I had to hire him. It was that kind of introduction. Princeton's loss was our gain. Okay, let me talk for a few minutes about what we are here to talk about in this room, which is the left-right problem. And the nature of the problem really is that the right is increasingly pro-Israel, and the left is increasingly anti-Israel. In the US, by any measure, Republican and conservative support for Israel has soared in the last few decades. Take a 2015 Pew poll. 75% of Republicans said they sympathize more with Israel than with the Palestinians. 43% of Democrats said that. 75-43. A huge, more than 30-point gap. Unsurprisingly, among Democrats, the further left you are, the more pro-Palestinian you are. So self-described conservative and moderate Democrats, 53% are more sympathetic to Israel, 19% to the Palestinians, 53-19. But among self-described liberal Democrats, 40% more sympathetic to the Palestinians and only 33% with Israel. Age also matters. Younger Democrats are more sympathetic to the Palestinians, and you can go cohort by cohort among Democrats and in the American population at large, people who are 70 to 90, the most pro-Israel, very slightly less for those who are 53 to 71, and down to millennials who were a rotten group of young kids who are more pro-Israel than Palestine, but only by 16 points, not by the 40 or 50 that we're accustomed to. So why is this? Gallup suggested one theory based on its own recent polling, 2016 polling. Quote, "The partisan gap in American support for Israel has widened over the past decade and a half as Republicans warmed to Israel during George W. Bush's administrations. Democrat sympathies with Israel also grew during this period, just not as much. Millennials actually showed a net decrease in support for Israel, 2006 to 2016, while millennials' support for the Palestinians tripled from 9 to 27%. Now, some of this, I suppose, is Obama. Some of this is the sense that the president who represents the Democratic Party, the American center-left, is pro-Palestinian, so people follow. Similarly, support for Israel grows under Bush. So this is no great surprise, right? Support for Israel among Republicans grows under Bush. Support for Palestinians among Democrats grows under Obama. No great surprise. And that provides one answer to the question, why is this happening? Leadership, national leadership. What people at the top do and say matters. But we're dealing obviously with a phenomenon here that's broader, that's larger than Bush and Obama. It goes back a long ways. I just want to read you a quote from a professor at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, Amnon Kavari. He looked at the data for the last half century since the '67 war. The most significant change is that of partisan groups. In contrast to 1967, Democratic identifiers became, as people who identify as Democrats, became the least supportive group among all other major demographic divisions, whereas Republicans became the most supportive group. Republicans exceeding even the Jewish population and evangelical Christians, the two most pro-Israel groups in contemporary America. This is a long trend. One has to ask why. Okay, leadership, but that explains the last decade more. What I would like to do is something we haven't been doing enough of here today at this conference. Let's blame the Jews. I want to blame the Jews. Politicians need to get elected, right? It is the career of a politician to cater to voters. depending on things like the size of the voter group, the salience of the issue. There's an article this year by two Democrats whose names you will know, Andrew Stein and Douglas Schoen. And they wrote, one reason Democrats have continued the move away from Israel is that Jewish voters haven't exacted a price for it. Continuing the quote, exit polls in 2016 found that is, Jewish voters, exit polls in 2016 found they supported Mrs. Clinton over Trump 71 to 23, in line with their historic levels of Democratic support. This is important. I mean, there are some politicians who will care about Israel, who will support Israel, even if their own voters really don't care. The example I'd give you is Scoop Jackson from Washington State, but it's rare. It's rare. If American Jews tell Democratic politicians, I will vote for you even if you don't support Israel, well, guess what? More Democratic politicians will go ahead and not support Israel and cater instead to leftist and pro-Palestinian groups. I mean, again, not a great surprise. So that problem is that Jewish Democrats don't vote Israel. They vote based on other matters that they deem more important. You know, that may seem obvious, and we all know this, right? The thing that's striking about it is not an international phenomenon. It is not a diaspora phenomenon. British Jews, Canadian Jews, Australian Jews shifted their votes and their party support over time basically from left of center to right of center to more conservative parties as those parties became more or less pro-Israel. American Jews are actually the outliers here. American Jews are the least supportive, the least Zionist of the major diaspora Jewish populations. How does all this happen? How does the left turn against Israel? How do liberals and leftists explain to themselves what they're doing? Well, I hate the term narratives, but it's useful here, and Professor Kavari from the IDC helps again, and he wrote that starting about 15 years ago, so basically 2000, Democrats and liberals began to identify with the Palestinians, emphasizing human rights concerns, while Republicans, religious and ideological conservatives, began to identify Israel as just a state under attack. Similar comment from Stein and Schoen. There was once an inexorable link between support for Israel and the civil rights movement. Both were responses to invidious discrimination, anti-Semitism, racism. Starting in the mid-60s, however, an anti-Israel minority emerged in the form of the New Left. These groups, such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Students for Democratic Society, Black Panthers, saw Israelis as oppressors and Palestinians as engaged in a just struggle for liberation. That phrase, a just struggle for liberation, comes from Huey Newton of the Black Panthers. Continuing, from Stein and Schoen, in the 1970s, elements of the left became steadily more hostile to Israel. A turning point came in 1975 when the UN passed a resolution equating Zionism with racism. That provided an intellectual and political opening for those who wanted to drive a wedge between Israel and America. Let me put it a different way, this lack of support for Israel, this refusal to change votes, party support, because of the drift away or toward Israel, is pretty much an American phenomenon. It's not really found elsewhere in the diaspora. What is found everywhere is the fact that the left is turning against Israel. That really is a global phenomenon. I mean, look at Europe. It is true, of course, that levels of support for Israel are higher in the US in every category, higher than in Europe, the left, the center, the right. But the Pew polls found, quote, Western Europeans who placed themselves on the left expressed strong support for the Palestinians. More than twice as many sympathized with the Palestinians than with Israel. It was 41-19, it's more than 2 to 1. Why? Well, part of it is anti-Semitism. Or to put the phrase more directly and less academically, hatred of Jews. I think it plays a large role. Another part is probably that, Ariel Sharon was elected in 2000. So Israel has for 17 years now had right-wing governments. It isn't surprising to see some reduction in support on the left. And there's one more aspect I think that's critical, particularly in Europe. Israel's a nation state. Europeans for the last few decades have been campaigning against the nation state and against nationalism, with the view that nationalism is a kind of poison that leads to war and racism and repression and hatred and discrimination. Nationalism is understood as being akin to racism, as a root of fascism. And in Israel, you have a people who are nationalist, people who will fight and kill and die to defend their nation. And perhaps worse yet, Israel is the nation state of one people, the Jews. So, with rare exceptions, European leftists find all of that horrifying. Of course, it should not go without saying, it should be said, the Palestinians wish to create a nation state that would not be democratic, that would not respect human rights, that would practice another form of nationalism, that would be Judenrein, and so on. But all of that attracts no attention or criticism on the European left. So we're dealing here with long-term, pretty deep trends. It isn't just Sharon and Netanyahu, it isn't just Bush and Obama. I'd just take 1 minute to say what would change things. Well, peace between Israelis and Palestinians would change things, but the kind of peace that would, a real peace, is not going to happen, in my opinion. The kind of peace deal that might happen would actually put the Jewish state at risk immediately, and Israelis would act to defend themselves, and so we'd be right back where we started, or worse off. So, despite the song to the contrary, peace is not the answer. An end to anti-Semitism would help. But which is less likely, peace or an end to anti-Semitism? I leave that to you. I think I can suggest two things. One, to take advantage of all the governments or populations that are not anti-Israel, whether that's in the Arab world or Europe or anywhere else, Asia, Latin America. And actually, Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing a superb job. The outreach that Israel is undertaking now is really quite extraordinary, breaking down Israel's putative isolation. It is true that things are worse on the left in, Norway and Sweden, and meanwhile, Israel is building relationships with India and China, which actually have larger populations than Norway and Sweden. So Jewish conservatives should try to advance, and if possible, help that process. The other thing is also perhaps hopeless, but worth mentioning again. American Jews should behave a bit more like Jews everywhere else in the world and vote for Israel. That is, American Jews should let politicians know that hostility to Israel will cost a politician or a party their vote. Keith Ellison's near selection as head of the Democratic National Committee and his selection as deputy should, for example, cost votes and money. Today's Democratic leadership in Congress is very pro-Israel. It is also very old. Nancy Pelosi is 76. Steny Hoyer is 78. Dianne Feinstein is 84. Ben Cardin on Senate Foreign Relations is 74. Elliott Engel on House Foreign Affairs is the spring chicken. He's 70. tomorrow's Democratic Party may well be led by people whose credentials on Israel are very different. People like Keith Ellison and Tom Perez and Kamala Harris, and of course, acolytes of Bernie Sanders. The party will kowtow to the left and to pro-Palestinian forces unless and until there is a price to pay for doing so. As I said, that's perhaps hopeless, but as the party moves further left and anti-Israel voices are louder, perhaps not entirely hopeless. Final point, just a reminder. The support for Israel on the right is reasonably new. It certainly wasn't there, and Mike has written about this a good deal. We go back to the Eisenhower years, about which he has written expertly. It's a gift, if not a miracle. It's a phenomenon of recent decades. It may not be permanent. It should be cultivated and celebrated and rewarded. Thanks.
Elliott, thanks for that. As I was listening to you, I was formulating a kind of counter argument. I'd love to get your reaction to it. I went to some prominent lobbyists after the nuclear deal and suggested that they should work to punish all the people that voted for the Iranian nuclear deal. And I was told that there really wasn't a good avenue for punishment, and that the people that were in unsafe seats had people who were even worse waiting in the. This goes to your generational argument. Had people that were even worse waiting for them, and so I guess the larger argument would go something like this. There was a time when Jews lived in places in states where their votes were important. They had a role in the media and so on that was very important, and they could make donations that were very important. In an age when the internet has made fundraising from the grassroots possible for people like Bernie Sanders, when the Jews, the only swing state that matters where there's a large Jewish population anymore is probably Florida, and money and the old journalistic elite and everything, it doesn't have the power it had anymore. It just isn't possible for the Jews to punish people who don't support Israel.
There's no doubt some truth to that. And you can, look at individual states and ask, well, California is a Democratic state, But, take New York. It would have mattered to the vote on the JCPOA if the New York congressional delegation, just to take the House delegation, had voted against it or had split on it, or had even split. If the Democrats had split, 50-50, that's all. But Democrats who had lots of Jews in their districts in California, Florida, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, didn't feel the need to do that. There were 2 or 3 who did, but basically they didn't feel the need to do that because they knew Jewish voters would not punish them. So I think, when there are close votes and some of these things are close, it would matter.
Yeah, and we know.
So I just don't buy it.
Yeah. Now, there was one word that I don't think occurred in your talk. I could be wrong. I don't think it did. One name, and that's Trump, right? And because there's a widespread feeling in the land that Trump represents something totally new and different in our politics, not just. And there are many angles to this. and I'd like to explore several with you. But one, of course, is the claim that Trump represents, in an American context, blood and soil nationalism, and that there's embedded in that a large amount of anti-Semitism. So first of all, I wonder how you would react to that. So in other words, you painted a picture of growing Republican support, but today we don't even know what Republicanism means anymore, in a sense. So.
Well, there's some truth to it. I mean, look at Steve Bannon as an example, who flirts with the alt-right all the time. You might say is part of the alt-right, and yet I gather is very pro-Israel personally, whatever that means. Obviously, the president is personally. So I don't really have an answer to the question. I mean, I do think, first, there is a pretty clear way in which the trends I was talking about, where the left, the Democratic Party, is less supportive of Israel, those trends will be enlarged by the Trump presidency. Because I think what you'll have is a lot of Democrats saying, well, what do we learn from looking at Obama and Trump? We learned from our guy that the Israelis are a problem, they're trouble, they're asking for too much, they're giving, but Trump seems to like the Israelis a lot. So it deepens the sense that Israel, right, anti-Israel, Palestinian, left. And I mean, obviously that's, that's not good for the pro-Israel community in the United States. I think that at this point is almost inevitable. And the data suggested it happened under Bush, who was in a sense, a very traditional president. I guess one question is, how much anti-Semitism do you think there is in the United States?
Right.
And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there is poll data that suggests this is not Europe. There isn't a hell of a lot. It's out there. Obviously, it's out there in every country. But how fearful you are, I think, depends on your view of what there is to excite.
I have to tell you a story. Forgive me. I was down in Florida, actually speaking for AIPAC about 3 weeks ago, and I finished on Saturday at about 1 o'clock. I had a real hard schedule, and so I decided to treat myself. I went to the bar. This is in, where was I? I can't even remember. It wasn't Miami. It was Fort Lauderdale. And so at the bar, out by the water, like a cabana, and I'm sitting next to a guy who's about 5 years younger than me, a little bit overweight, covered in tattoos, but clearly has money. He's there for the boat show. And we started talking about politics, and he was from Minnesota. And he said, I carry, and my wife, she carries. And so, the point is, no Jewish aspect about him whatsoever. I mean, this guy was not Jewish. So I said to him, what do you do for a living? And he said, I have a business. I said, what business? And he said, I run a kosher tanker cleaning company. And I said, what do you mean? He said, on the highway, the tankers you see, they have all these liquids, right? He said, just about everything you drink is kosher, and it's got to be carried on the highway. And has to be, a rabbi has to, bless it and seal it. And I said, are you Jewish? He said, no. How can I possibly be Jewish? Anyway, I just thought it's a great country, right?
But it is, I mean, there is something, I think the association of Republicans with Israel is really very deep. And it was long before Trump, it'll be long after Trump. And I am reminded of, to just tell one story, a few years ago, briefing the incoming class of freshman congressmen, Republican freshman congressmen. It was one of those years when there were a lot of them. And what were they interested in? It was very interesting to listen to them. People from, Wyoming, Nebraska, states where there were basically no Jews in their district, saying, I was elected to come here to Washington. They didn't use the phrase drain the swamp, but I'll tell you what make America strong again, increase the defense budget, cut the deficit, and support Israel. It was really very striking.
Yeah. By the way, I asked the guy, how did you get to be a kosher tank cleaning business? And he said, Rabbi came to me and said, because of where he was located, and said if I'd pay him $5,000, he'd bring me a lot of business. And so that's the way it started.
All right, that's the end of that story.
He said the strangest
Moving
thing.
right along.
No, the rabbi made him a millionaire anyway. So, look, I tend to, I feel that I'm not Jewish. And
Do you have tattoos and do you carry? That's the other.
I don't carry, and I don't yet have a tattoo. I kind of, one of my conceits is I've lived all over the country and in a lot of different places and among rich people and poor people. And I feel like I have a good sense of the country. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But I personally don't buy any of this business of the anti-Semitism on the right. I mean, there's anti-Semitism on the right, there's anti-Semitism, there's racism on the right, there's racism on the left. But I mean, in terms of a broad trend, I don't buy it. So let me give you another theory I have. I'm just interested to get your take on this, because maybe it's wrong. It's not a theory, it's a thought that occurred to me. It strikes me, you know the joke about what's the difference between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders?
Yes.
Yeah, Donald Trump has Jewish grandchildren. You probably all heard this. So so here you got a guy who's got a daughter who's converted. He seems to have no problem with it, and so on. And here you have Bernie Sanders, who Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor is a guy named Matt Deuce. I don't know if you guys know him. Matt Deuce is as anti-Israel as you can possibly be. So you look at that, and the claim that Bannon is Hitler, right? All of the Hitler rhetoric, Nazism, all of that, rising fascism, rising Nazism, and so on. I wonder if it doesn't reflect, because I don't buy it. Now, we could argue about whether it's real or not, but I don't buy it. If it doesn't reflect a certain unease on the left, that they might actually lose the Jews. Because the fact that we have to go, I mean, it's not just that, wow, there's some unpleasant currents out there. We have to go straight to, Trump is Heinrich Himmler, right?
That's very interesting. I mean, some percentage of the people who are saying that believe it. But I think you may well be right that one of the things they're doing is that it expresses because look, let me back up. Just go back up a few presidents. Here's Bill Clinton. And one of Bill Clinton's great claim to fame is that he almost gave Yasser Arafat a country. I mean, he failed in the end at Camp David, but he tried as hard as he could, and he almost managed to do it.
Yasser didn't want it.
And then the next Democratic president is Barack Obama, who's reasonably hostile to Israel, right up to that last UN vote in December of 2016. On the other side, you get Bush with the 2014 letter to Sharon where he says there will be no right of return. And obviously, Israel keeps the major blocs, first president to say that. And we may just be a few days away from the next Republican president saying Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Well, that's a remarkable contrast. And it ought to make Democrats who are thinking about this, calculating about this, it ought to make them nervous. I mean, again, I'd say I don't see any sign of it. That is, I don't think there's poll data from Pew or Gallup or anybody that suggests that's happening. And Jews are still voting, with one exception, Jews are still voting other issues. The one exception is I was going to say Orthodox Jews, let's say traditional Jews, because it's clear that is not the voting pattern of Orthodox Jews. And one could argue, well, over time, the Jewish community will be more Orthodox for obvious demographic reasons. But for the same demographic reasons, the Jewish community will be smaller. So I guess if I were a Democratic strategist, I would not yet be afraid of that. I would not see signs of it yet anywhere.
Why don't you mentioned, because I know you're in close touch with the White House, why don't you give us, it's a little bit off topic, but you just brought it up, what you think is going to happen on Wednesday. What's your best sense of what Trump is going to do?
You know, go back to the JCPOA. What happened there apparently was that, you know, the president said during the campaign, this is a terrible agreement, and he was then told, yeah, but you got to certify. And because the administration was very new, it was January or February, he was persuaded to do it, but he clearly didn't like it. And when it came around the second time, he said, I'm not doing this. I don't believe this. I think that's what we're seeing now. He did do this Jerusalem Embassy Act waiver the first time, but he obviously didn't like it, and it does contradict what he said during the campaign. So I think the chances are pretty good that what he will do next week when he has to make this certification is say Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Now, one might say, I mean, it's 2017, what's the big deal? But if it weren't a big deal, it would have happened decades ago. President after president, literally every single presidential candidate has said, well, not Bernie Sanders, but he wasn't the nominee of a major party. I'm going to move the capital, I'm going to move the embassy, and yet they don't do it. And they don't do it because they are, to use an old expression, mau-maued by the State Department and Arab leaders. The world is going to come to an end if you do this. There will be rioting in every Arab capital. People will break relations with us. You will destroy the peace process. Now, some of that is what, you know, was what Bush was told about what he did in 2004. I think that this is the upside of Trump being very different from his predecessors. There are downsides and upsides. And this upside is that, you know, when the State Department says, you're not going to, his tendency is to say, shut up. So now so that first, recognize Israel as the capital of Israel. Recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That doesn't mean that the President of the United States is drawing Israel's capital's final borders. Saab Erekat, the Palestinian negotiator, said yesterday, I think it was, the President of the United States doesn't have the right to decide what Israel's capital is. It was sort of interesting, but he thinks he has the right. Palestinians have the right. But so I think the President will say, you know, the final borders of Jerusalem will be settled in peace negotiations. Actually, Israel may change the borders in the sense that there are bills in the Knesset. As you know, Jerusalem was greatly enlarged. This was Dayan mostly after 67. And Jerusalem has never, ever in history been as large in terms of municipal boundaries as it is now. And then they include some odd things at the outer edges, like the Shuafat refugee camp. I think on the embassy, look, you can't, in fact, move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem tomorrow. You could do it in a kind of phony way in the sense that, yeah, you can switch the sign on the consulate building on Agron Street, so it doesn't say consulate anymore, it says embassy. That's not moving the embassy. Moving the embassy, if you were intent on doing it, would take something like 5 years, because embassies are hard to build nowadays due to the threat of terrorism. You have decisions to make, like, do you co-locate the ambassador's residence? Generally speaking, if you think of Cairo and Amman, we do. We have a big compound, and there's an embassy building, and there's an ambassador's residence, and there's a motor pool, and there's lots of stuff there. So it requires a good piece of land. The piece of land that the United States has in Jerusalem is under 8 acres, which may not be large enough, because then you want a security perimeter. So the most you could do if you really plan to do it is to say, we should move the embassy and the ambassador to Jerusalem, and we'll start looking at this process. And it would, it would certainly take 5 years to do. It might take longer. So I'm less worried. Some people say that if you make this formal recognition that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but you don't instantly change that sign, it's a phony. I don't think that's right. I'm less concerned about the edifice and more concerned about Israel being, today, the only country on the face of the earth which does not get to choose its own capital. And it seems to me that this refusal to acknowledge Jerusalem, any part of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, is part of the general delegitimization, or refusal of legitimacy to Israel. And I think it's plausible that once the United States does this, huge denunciations all over the place. I think it's possible that it starts a process, and that we will not be the only country that recognizes Jerusalem, 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 years from now.
Right. Let me ask you one more question about Obama. I mean, your analysis suggests, and we have agreed, and of course we understand the world, so we've agreed that the Republican Party is going to, Trump is going to be pro-Israel. And your analysis also suggested that the American Jews, by and large, are not going to start voting Republican. They're really, that we can't really hold out much hope to that. And I wonder if Obama, nevertheless, wasn't, and when I say Obama, I mean the two things especially, the nuclear deal and the little punch he gave to the Israelis as he left the door, as he walked out the door. If that wasn't a bit of a wake-up call for Democratic Jews, I feel like when I talk to, because I came from academia, I still have a few friends who are Democrats, and I noticed that there is, when you get them behind closed doors and they talk freely, there was a real unease about it. But they don't, in public, they don't say it. So is it possible that something broke loose there that we could work with?
Yeah, it is. I mean, certainly there is going to be some number of American Jews who feel that way, American Jewish Democrats who feel that way. But what's the impact? That is, what do they do about it? So, for example, the major American Jewish institutions, ADL, American Jewish Committee, does it change their behavior in any way? I haven't seen it. ADL post-Foxman is probably moving left, not right. Yeah. It may be that the American Jewish Committee post-David Harris moves left, not right. It may be that the Conference of Presidents post-Malcolm Hoenlein moves left, not right. I mean, we'll see. One way, here's a way to judge next week. If the president goes through with this on Jerusalem, there'll be statements by all these major, take your favorite dozen Jewish organizations. What do they say? Does the statement reflect joy and gratitude? Does it reflect concern? Well, but the Arabs are going to be very mad. This may hurt the peace process. There is no peace process, but this may hurt the peace process. What are they?
That's Ruth Weiss's the story about the guy who wanted no enemies and didn't want to. Comes to mind. There's going to be a lot of that. What is the tone of their remark? Is it sort of gritted teeth, thanks to the president for doing this, or even, largest denomination reform? What is this? What does Rick Jacobs say? Does he express thanks, or does he express mostly concern that the peace process will now be hurt? So let me rephrase the question.
does this make Orthodox, the phenomenon of Obama, did it make Orthodox Jews feel less at home in the Democratic Party and lead more of them away from it to neutrality or to being more Republican? How about traditional but non-Orthodox Jews? I mean, we can kind of split up the community that way. The answer can't be no, never, didn't have that effect on anybody. I just don't know how large a phenomenon it was. And again, I think you'll have a counter influence in some Jewish circles because they don't like President Trump. So, you know, you can only measure this in the rearview mirror when you see the polls.
It's unfortunate, I mean, that Trump doesn't, by the nature of his person, I mean, sort of characterologically.
The Jews don't like the style.
And, yeah, the style is so off-putting, and he can't, if there is a potential there, he can't exploit it because of who he is in so many ways. I talked to an Israeli official recently, and I asked him what's the difference between working with Obama and Trump. And he said, under Obama, we had relentless resentment and contempt. And he said, under Trump, we're dealing with chaotic friendship. And he said, and chaotic friendship is better than resentment and contempt. All right, with that, let's open it up to the audience. And we have microphones here. I guess so line up, and we'll start on the right.
Hi, Larry Greenfield from LA. Two tests or ideas regarding conservatives, our camp. The Friendship Gratitude alliance between Jews and Christians, I think, is tested a bit. Do you sense any resentment among pro-Israel conservatives at the Forward and Peter Beinart and other Jewish leftists? The second challenge would be the broader conversation now about foreign policy, some in the conservative coalition resisting American national security leadership and presence and the Iraq War, et cetera.
Pardon me 1 second. You're very tricky. As our first guy, you got your 2 questions in, but after this, I'm going to police it. 1 question only.
Oh boy, I mean, these are questions that deserve about 2 hours each. I think, in the long run, I don't worry. Let me take the second question. I don't worry about in the long run, the impact of Iraq and Afghanistan. In the short run, there's been tremendous damage, and I think because a lot of Americans have come to the conclusion that globalism, internationalism, world leadership, just war and spending in blood and treasure, and it's hopeless. And what did we get? And we're still there, and it's 15 years later. So, and we saw that in the election campaign last year, and it's not, in a certain sense, not terribly surprising. But I think Americans do believe this is the greatest country and we should be the leaders of the world. And I think it's a pendulum. And my colleague at the council, Steve Sestanovich, wrote a very good book about this pendular movement between presidents who are moving forward and others who are pulling back the way Obama, for example, did after Bush. So maybe I'm too optimistic, but it seems to me it is in many ways a predictable reaction to, in a sense, endless and very costly wars. On the resentment, I think there's, I get asked this question plenty, and I suppose you do too, by very friendly evangelicals, Catholics, others. I mean, the question comes down to, what's the matter with the Jews? What is the matter? Why are Jews liberals? A subject Norman Pohortz wrote a whole book about. And it's a complicated, when the question is asked genuinely, it's a very difficult question to answer, and you can't answer it standing on one foot. But I don't see resentment. I see incomprehension, which to a certain extent I guess we all share.
Yeah, that's exactly my experience. They say, I just had this conversation. I don't understand it. Can you explain it to me? Sir.
You mentioned in your introductory remarks that you didn't know whether the love affair between the Republicans or the right and Israel would last over time. So if you could take out your crystal ball, which you're pretty good at, and speculate how that might play out, whether it goes well and it remains a good love affair, or if it goes sour, how that might pan out.
I'm pretty optimistic about that. One has to say, well, what is the cause of what explains this, this love affair? Americans like countries that are well-governed democracies. I know a lot of Israelis would say Israel's not well-governed, but by global standards, it's pretty good. So Americans like countries that are good countries. Americans like countries that are good allies, that are really pro-American, that stay pro-American, that do not say, would you please come fight for us? That say, we will fight for ourselves, thank you. Give us the tools and we will do the job. Americans care about terrorism and realize that a number of countries, but obviously Israel, is on our side and is a victim of terrorism and an opponent of terrorism. You can add all that up. It seems to me that all of those are on the terrorism part, sadly, long-term matters. I don't see what would change that. Yes, at some point you will have a left-of-center government in Israel, I suppose. But what constitutes being left-of-center in Israel? If Avi Gabay is the next prime minister, by American standards, he's center-right on many of these issues. So I don't see what would cause this very long-term trend to change.
Thank you. One of the other things that Kavare, who you spoke about, has written is that in the long run, traditionally supporting Congress for Israel has been higher than that in the presidency, with exceptions obviously throughout. But episodically, we see a lot of times a president making a decision and he's restrained by Congress. So in the context of the changes that we've seen in terms of this support and the lack of, political accountability, especially from the left, what other recourses would remain available to kind of be able to restrain the president's ability should the congressional avenue kind of?
It's hard because what can Congress do? Not pass a treaty or not appropriate money. Or I guess we can add, and not confirm an official. Most of foreign policy, we have a president-centric system. Presidents control foreign policy. I used to work for Scoop Jackson, and he did, for example, on the treaty question, trying to defeat the SALT treaty that Nixon and Kissinger had negotiated. You can do that, and that can restrain a president. Obama learned that lesson, so he didn't submit the JCPOA as a treaty because he was afraid that would he was confident that would happen. It is hard to judge the level of support for Israel in Congress because some of the votes are freebies, where a member of Congress looks at the vote and says, well, I'm not really in control of anything, so it's just a matter of politics for me, whether I vote no because those guys like it or yes because those guys like it. So what would actually happen if they were in control, I think, is harder to judge. But as we saw in the Obama administration, I mean, how did Congress restrain what was really a pretty anti-Israel policy? It didn't. I mean, the one thing that Congress could say is you're not going to cut aid to Israel. You can try, and we'll just plus it up and plus it up. That the White House does not control. And White House efforts to say, we will cut the aid if you do this or this, that Congress, money, that Congress can control. Other than that, I would say, as we saw with Obama, it is really very hard to turn around presidentially led foreign policy when the president is intent on moving in a certain direction.
On the topic of congressional accountability, and actually voters holding elected officials accountable, it seems to me that one of the key differentiators between the American Jewish population and the Jewish populations of Canada, the UK, Australia, and every other country is the extent to which Jews in this country are assimilated. Do you feel comfortable as full-fledged members of this country?
Yeah.
Don't see a potential threat down the
Yeah.
future? Short of the catastrophic happening in the future, what would it take to get left-leaning Americans to realize, to vote as an ethnic bloc, see that they are, and understand the self-identification issues that then cause them to vote for
It's a very good question. Only bad things. I'll tell you a story. We are in a hall called Edmund J. Safra Hall. Edmund J. Safra was a banker born in Aleppo, later international banker, had banks here in New York, and I knew Edmund Safra. And I actually worked for his bank in Geneva one summer when I was in college. And working for his bank, a Jewish-owned private bank in Geneva, I found out something very interesting, which is that Jews around the world, from Argentina and Brazil and Chile and Peru and Panama and France and Germany and Italy and Russia and everywhere else, had secret Swiss bank accounts. And American Jews didn't. Why didn't they? Exactly for the reasons you state. Because the idea that, it could happen here, we might have to flee, that's just not the life experience of American Jews. It is the life experience of Jews elsewhere. What would lead that to change would be, I think, only one of two things. Really bad things happening here, or really bad things happening to Israel. So, since we hope and pray neither of those things are likely or will happen, then I think it's going to be really hard to turn those trends around.
Hi. I'm co-president of a new organization in Michigan called the Michigan Jewish Action Council. It's for conservative Jews, or Jewish conservatives. Based on what you've said so far, we don't have from you an issue of where do we go with this. So my question is based on where do we go with this. We have a limited amount of human resources within our group, and we want to be careful on what we choose to do. So we're deciding between having some effect, perhaps, with Ahavas Yisrael, to reach across the divide to our leftist brothers and sisters, and try to break through the programming and de-indoctrinate them, and show them that there's more value for them in a more central. I wouldn't expect them to go to the right position. Or, and this is based on a recent segment that Cheryl Atkinson did on what happens when a person comes to Congress, and the first thing that happens, she did an interview, I think the representative's name was Buckley or Buckman or something like that. Money. Do we go to our leftist friends, or do we go to the huge Jewish donors and tell them, we want you to vote with your dollars for those who are going to help Israel? So that's the divide. Do we put our money? Oh, and I guess I should give it a little context. We're talking about that with respect to University of Michigan, where on campus, the situation for Jewish students is horrible. They kind of talk that they'll do something better, but we think at this point, talking to the regents is silly. We need to go to the major Jewish donors and talk with them. So that's the question.
I'm tempted to say, hey, I only do foreign policy. But I think the latter, not the former. That is, I think outreach to people who are already defining themselves as leftists is unlikely to be all that productive. Whereas I think in the case of universities, if they began to feel a reduction in contributions, they meaning the administrators and the trustees, who are often big donors, I think that would be the way to get their attention. And I think it'd be the best way to get their attention. So on that choice, I'd go for the second one personally.
Universities also hate controversy, so if you can just get them bad press for any reason, they're sheep.
Do you think that what the left perceives as a Republican surge in anti-Semitism is actually young members of the alt-right who don't usually vote Republican, who didn't vote for Bush or Romney per se, and don't hold traditionally conservative views like belief in the free market?
I'm not sure that we know the answer to that. I think we need more data, but it sounds right to me. For one, I would only change one thing you said, which is the word voter, because I don't know how many of these people are actually voters. I think there's probably a fair number of them who vote never or intermittently. Maybe some came out for Trump, maybe. But I generally think that's probably right. I think one of the interesting things to see over the next year or two is learning more about this phenomenon. Who are the so-called alt-right? And what motivates them? Because, let's take an example. Who's voting for Judge Roy Moore and why? And obviously there's going to be a lot of different people. Some people are just voting party line, period, end of statement. Others are going to be voting against the New York Times telling them what to do. There'll be a series of, and some are voting racism. There'll be a long series of explanations, but I don't think we really know the answer yet.
Mark?
Hi, thank you. It's very hard to get people to switch parties. It just doesn't happen. I think you explained some of that. I think other reasons, Trump is making it harder. I think there's just the social, especially social liberal things that happen that people feel the Republicans are never going to change on, like abortion, that make it hard for people to switch. So if you look at the Democratic Party, is it time to try and create or help them create something like a Republican Jewish coalition inside the Democrats? Where is the Democratic Jewish coalition that actually is different from an AIPAC or an APL or something like that, that has as its mission driving that?
Yeah.
And nominally, there would even probably be some Democrats in this room who view conservatism within the Democratic Party more as a Jacksonian Democrat than what we have today and predominantly in the party.
Yeah. If you go back to the 70s, you had the kind of McGovernite takeover of the Democratic Party, and there was a reaction, a thing almost using the term you mentioned. There is, of course, the National Jewish Democratic Council, but we had CDM, the Coalition for Democratic Majority, which was basically a bunch of Scoop Jackson and Hubert Humphrey supporters who were fighting to take back the Democratic Party, and it included people like Gene Kirkpatrick and Max Kampelman and Admiral Zumwalt, Norman Podhoretz, me. Actually, a bunch of us in 1980 met with President Carter because he and Mondale were making an effort to say, you're Democrats. You have to stay within the Democratic Party. You can't move over and be for Reagan, but I would have to tell you 20 minutes with Jimmy Carter. That was the end. For everybody in that room, that was the end of that. But that fight, absolutely, yes. Democrats, it is hard to get people to change party. In America, it's particularly hard. There's a lot of Jews in England who moved from, Labour to Tory, and in Australia who voted for John Howard, so on. But here it's particularly hard for social issues, and again, Jews don't like the president's style, it seems. So that fight has to be fought within the Democratic Party as well, which is, I assume, what Stein and Schoen were doing in that, I think it was a Wall Street Journal op-ed piece. Absolutely. And in a certain way, this may be a good moment for that. First, because the rise of Bernie Sanders has shown some Democrats, wow, there's a very strong far left wing of this party. Secondly, because we have just come to the end of a very long period of Clinton family control of the Democratic Party. So what's the future of the Democratic Party post-Clinton? Well, nobody knows. I think the nomination next time is really up for grabs. So this would be the moment for such a group within the Democratic Party to and maybe it's better done as Jews, and maybe it isn't better done as Jews, but in any event, for that kind of group within the party to form itself up, get a bunch of big Democratic donors of the Chaim Saban variety who are now, you know, floating in a world without the Clintons.
Wow, you know, listening to you reminds me, for those of you who wish you could hear Elliott more, he did a great Crystal conversation, kind of with Bill Crystal. I remember listening to that. I've spent, you know, I don't know, hundreds of hours sitting in Elliott's office listening to him talk to people, and I thought I had heard everything, and then I listened to the Crystal conversation, and I learned more in there, things I'd never heard about some of the history, because Elliott has been involved at the highest levels of government since the Carter administration, or at least since the Reagan administration. Please join me in thanking Elliott for what was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.